Welcome to the Disability News Report. I'm your host, Jennifer Price. Religion. That is a topic you're typically not supposed to talk about. It's not polite conversation to have. That is until today. That is where we're going. That is what we're talking about. My guest is Jessica Temple. She is a podcaster. Her podcast is Thriving in the Midst of Chaos. And she has her own personal story. And we're going to talk to her about her journey growing up Jewish, meeting her husband, who is also Jewish, the two of them beginning to have a family. And then they realize that their child has a disability. And it's perfectly fine. They have, they're learning how to, work with that and get various resources for the child. However, what they didn't expect was negative treatment from members of their own synagogue. So she's going to talk to us about her journey. This is simply her journey. It's certainly not a reflection onto the whole entire Jewish faith, but this is her story. And that's what we're talking about today, the intersection of religion and disability. Coming up next. All right, so welcome to the show, Jessica. It's great to have you on.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much for asking me. Happy to be
Yeah.
here.
Yeah, no, the topic of religion, typically is like one of those, you're not supposed to go there, talk about anything else other than, religion and politics. But when I heard your story and listening to your podcast, Thriving in the Midst of Chaos, I think you may have mentioned it in the introduction to one of your guests, actually, if I remember correctly. Then I thought that this would be a great time to talk about the intersection between disability and religion, because it's really not a topic that I have heard discussed a lot, but certainly I do know that people have various journeys, including yours. So I can't wait to jump into it.
Absolutely. And some of the guests that I've had on the podcast have very briefly mentioned it, but usually it's just mentioned as that it's really helpful or that it helps get people through. So I'm really glad that you're discussing it.
Yeah. That's interesting. I do know, I know locally, we have a church here that has a special parent group for parents with children with disabilities. But when I saw that, I was really surprised because I just not seen that before.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, that's phenomenal.
Yeah. So why don't we just start sort of with your background in terms of how you were raised, in the type of household from a religious standpoint you were raised in?
Sure. So I was raised in a conservative Jewish household, although we kind of, I guess, vacillated back and forth between more like secular conservative versus and conservative Judaism. So my dad came from a family that wasn't super duper observant, and my mom's parents were actually raised Orthodox Jewish. So when they got married, they started to become a little bit more observant with conservative Judaism. And then I got very involved with my Hebrew school and everything like that. And I went through confirmation, and it's something that I really loved. So because of that, we kept that conservative Judaism. And so, yeah, so we celebrated all the holidays, but we weren't super strict and uber observant.
Okay. And so I guess once you then moved into adulthood and began to, start your own family, husband, child, and all of that, did you begin to, I guess, what was your take and stance and position, or you and your husband's stance and position on how you're going to raise your family?
So that's an interesting question, especially for me, because I guess myself and my husband, we've both been through different religious journeys throughout our life. One of the things that I often share when I discuss religion is that I went to a predominantly Christian college, and there were, I think, 400 Jews out of 16,000 students. And I actually was discriminated against in that. And I will say nothing negative about the school itself. I love it so much. But I had bumper stickers placed on my car that said "Die Jew." So I was actually very fearful to let anyone know about my religion. And after that, I tended to just go celebrate the holidays with my family, and I kind of steered clear of that. But around that time, my husband actually had a very different experience. We both went on Birthright, which is something that Jewish teenagers and young adults can go on if they've never been to Israel and they're under 26. So he had gone, and it actually spurred him into being pretty Orthodox Jewish. So when we got married, I was still kind of in my I'm figuring things out phase, but because I wanted to be, I guess kind isn't the right word. I wanted to be supportive is the right word. So we plan to raise our children more observant Orthodox Jewish.
Okay. Okay. And they say hindsight is always 2020. So, just sort of thinking about your current experience in relation to the past of when you were coming up, can you think of times now when people may have been treated differently? Whereas now you could say, oh, well, maybe it's because this person had a disability.
You mean from a religious perspective?
Yeah, when you would go to temple.
So I'm going to answer that in two ways. So from the adults, no, I did not notice anything, at least when I was growing up. But when I was a child and a teenager, the other children I found were very, very discriminatory and very mean. And there was a lot of bullying toward people, especially who had autism. And I don't know if this is just pretty typical that there are a lot of kids and teenagers with autism, but in my Hebrew school and even in my regular school, my public school, which was predominantly Jewish children, there were a lot of people with autism, and they were all bullied horrendously, and they were by people who went to my Hebrew school. So I don't know if it was just the area, if it was their families or how they were raised or their personality, or if it was actually religion. But the people who tended to do the discrimination were actually of Jewish descent.
Okay. And so now you have a child, and your child, I believe, is 5.
Yes, so I actually have two. I have a 5-year-old and an almost 3-year-old who decides that he is now 3.
Yeah, we'll just go ahead and get rid of that almost. We're already there. um, and do both of them have special needs or one?
Sort of both of them. So my older child has autism, ADHD. It's kind of the letter soup of auditory processing disorder, sensory processing disorder. And my youngest is actually, other than ADHD symptoms, is doing very well, but was born with what we think was a perinatal stroke.
Okay. Okay. And now, did you begin to notice some differences in treatment once you began to bring your children to Temple?
Absolutely. So before we even knew that either of them had any disabilities or special needs, they were very very active, didn't sit still, kind of ran around, and there were a lot of dirty looks or kind of whispered comments. There were a lot of things that we weren't invited to that other people were. And the other parents, like especially because we sent Benji to a Jewish day school for early preschool, a lot of the other parents just stayed away from us or made nasty comments or whispered. And there were even times when I would say hello to them in the hall just to be friendly, and they would just look the other way and walk past me.
Okay. And do you notice that? Did your child also notice this distinction in treatment?
So he didn't say anything, but what I observed was a total shift in personality.
Mm.
So this child was and now is again a very bubbly, outgoing, extroverted, funny, fun social kid. And over the course of the year of being at that Jewish day school, he withdrew into himself. His fingers were bloody because he would bite his fingernails. He would hide in the corner. And I remember we had his birthday party there shortly before we pulled him out of school, and he pretty much wanted to be held the whole time or hid in a corner. And it was just devastating because his personality changed. So I'm assuming he noticed something, but he was probably too young to express it.
Sure. So I'm wondering, especially because you were not necessarily raised Orthodox, your husband was raised Orthodox.
He actually wasn't. He was born very secular. His mom is Jewish and his dad is Christian, and they didn't really follow any particular set of religious beliefs. So he really found it through his own searching for religion.
Oh, okay. Which then
Yeah.
brought him to the journey out
Yes.
to Israel. Okay. Oh, very
Hmm.
nice.
Yeah.
So then what was that experience like for the two of you as a couple in terms of, I'm just kind of wondering what were some of the conversations in terms of how it feels to receive that treatment from members of your own congregation?
Well, we both reacted a little bit differently. Was he didn't notice it quite as much until the treatment got pretty blatant. And so he didn't react as strongly until things started to happen over and over. And we really noticed a lot of personality and behavior changes in Benji. And then he got pretty upset. However, he really truly believed in the religion and it was really important to him. So he really tried to hold on and looked more toward Judaism to find answers for why this was happening and how he could really rectify that in his head and understand and make it right. I very quickly bowed out. And I truly don't mean to say to bash my religion because I it's individuals. It's not necessarily a whole religion that does A, B, or C. And this is not everyone's experience. I've talked to a lot of people in my religion and Judaism who have not had this experience. So I just want to put that out there that my goal is not to bash my religion. It's really just to share my personal experience.
Right.
However, I really did kind of say peace out. I will do anything for my kids. All I want in life is for the best for them, and that's the best treatment, the best opportunities. I just want them to be happy and safe and healthy. So when we started getting the treatment that we did, I pretty much tuned out and I was still respectful of my husband and his wishes, but I stopped participating. So I stopped going to synagogue. I stopped being as participatory in holidays and things like that. And I couldn't because there were so many things that happened. And I hope I'm not jumping the gun too much, but our community, once they found out our children had special needs, they pieced out. I mean, there was no connection. They disappeared. We really never heard from almost anybody again. And so we were really isolated. We had just moved to our area. And granted, I'm from this area, but I hadn't lived here since I was 18. And so we really had no support when we had really poured our heart and soul and everything into our religious community. There was at the first Jewish day school that we sent Benji, there was possible abuse, if not neglect, in that they weren't changing his diaper. So he would come home with crusty diapers and say that his his genitals hurt. So we're not quite sure what happened, but that was the first indication that I may not be participating in religious activities again because this just made me very nervous. And then when he started the other Jewish day school, which I actually attended for a year when I was a kid and had pretty good experiences with, and they essentially kicked him out because he was different. He had a disability. And they said that unless we went through all these evaluations, unless we had an ABA therapist, and this was before he was even diagnosed with anything, then he could not stay in that school. And I come to find out that this is very, very common, not only for this school, but for the Jewish day schools in our community. If anyone has any differences, including ADHD, they're required to have a one-to-one, and usually they are removed from the school quietly. And because no one wants to bash anyone else or really speak negatively, because people do make friends there, they haven't really talked about it. But I ended up hearing story after story that this kind of thing was happening. And
Okay,
so
because that was what I was wondering also, was he the only one with a disability, or the only one with the autism spectrum disorder? Or but you're saying that, I guess regardless of the specific disability, if there maybe if there's a behavioral component with it, then the JDS would want a one-to-one aid to assist the child throughout the day.
yeah, so if there was a learning disability, ADHD, a physical difference, a behavioral uh, disorder, anything like that, they had to have somebody or they were removed from the school. And
Oh, that's
sometimes they
pretty
didn't
broad.
even, sometimes they weren't even given the option of a one-to-one. It was, and this had to be someone from outside. So the school, because it's a private school, they didn't have to, and they did not provide assistance. So you had to provide your own services. But sometimes they weren't even given the option. They were just not allowed back to the school.
So how long has it been since you made the decision to leave? Um, well, I guess is that, am I understanding you correctly? At some point, did you make the decision to leave the temple, or did you, or are you saying you made the decision to leave um, that the Judaism?
I apologize for continuing to say this, but it's kind of complicated. So
I think this
we,
whole topic can be complicated because there's so many nuances to it.
it really is. So after that happened, I stopped going to synagogue. Um, I still, because it was an important part of my childhood growing up and even my teenagehood, I, s- I, I still kind of want my children to have some exposure to it to be able to make their own decisions because things may be different for them as they get older or as they grow into adulthood. And I still think it's important for them to know about our heritage. And it was, again, something important to our family, my grandparents, and everything like that. So we do at least get together with my family to celebrate holidays in a kind of more secular way. And we do celebrate things in our own way at home sometimes. And we definitely teach them about our heritage and teach them about the holidays and things like that. But I stopped going to synagogue shortly after Benji got kicked out of school. And I think it took Lewis a little bit longer because he was really trying to make it work. He was really trying to keep the puzzle pieces together and make everything make sense. But eventually he couldn't. And I had not joined a synagogue just because when we were living in Pennsylvania, I was really excluded and isolated because I don't really know how to explain it, but my perception was because I was a woman trying to get involved, but I wasn't born Orthodox. I wasn't wearing the traditional head covering. I wasn't doing all of the things that a traditional Orthodox woman would do, that I was excluded quite a lot. When I was living in Texas, that was not the case for the most part, except for one instance. But in Pennsylvania, it was. So at that point, really didn't I really wasn't too much of a part of the religious community as far as belonging to a synagogue, but I definitely didn't officially join one here, although Lewis had. So it took him a long time to really pull out of that community. But once we got the official diagnosis of autism for Benji shortly after Benji turned 3, that's when he pulled out because that's when the discrimination really started in the community at large.
So has it been 2 years since you have joined a synagogue?
Yes.
Okay. And so what has your spiritual journey been like in those 2 years?
Kind of like it was when I was an older teenager and a young 20s. I'm still trying to find my way because, again, there's a lot wrapped up in religion. I did have some pretty good experiences growing up. It was important to me growing up, but because of the treatment of people to me, to my family, to other people with disabilities growing up, I don't right now feel comfortable joining or rejoining the community. And what I think I want and what I've been doing is just celebrating the holidays with my family, teaching my children about the holidays, about the religion on our own, in our own way. And that's kind of where I am now.
Okay. So do you read the Torah?
I don't.
Okay.
I don't. I have in the past. I on my bookshelf over there, I had a ton of books about the laws and the ethics and the values and things like that. But I don't right now. It's really just interacting with the kids around the holidays and being with my family and celebrating the holidays that way. That's about as far as I go currently.
Okay. So it's still a part of you, just not formalized through a ceremony on a weekly basis, so to speak.
Yeah, it's more of kind of like the secular Judaism is how I've heard it called. It's not really as much the religious aspect as the social aspect.
Okay. Okay. Do you, I mean, it's probably a little soon because you're still in the thick of it. My thought is, do you have plans to seek out another synagogue in the future?
Not right now, but when the children get older, I'm thinking like mid to late elementary school, we really have some things to think about because for a while when the kids were little, and I don't know how while because the oldest is 5, but I was really gung ho that both of them would have a bar mitzvah. And I also wanted them to go to Hebrew school. But now I don't know. Like a big part of me is saying that it's still really important, but another part knows what I went through and the bullying that I went through in Hebrew school. And I really don't want my kids to go through that. But I also think it's important for them to get that education. So I really don't know. We might send them, we might do home teaching. I'm really not sure what we're going to do, but right now we don't have plans for the future for that.
So I think my last question is just to bring up that really just totally randomly someone reached out to me on LinkedIn and connected with me who authored a book titled was Yosef on the Spectrum. And it came and his connection came maybe a week before or 2 weeks before this interview was scheduled. So I, read through most of the book, not all of the book, but I'm just curious as to your thoughts on that title. I mean, the book is basically what the title how the title reads. It's a constant questioning of whether Yosef was on the spectrum based on various behaviors that he had, where today many of those behaviors have been attributed to children who are on the spectrum, whether it's difficulty with eye contact, difficulty in with social interactions, and the book really kind of goes through many different examples of where you read about this. So I know you haven't read the book. I'm assuming you haven't read the book, but I'm
Mm-mm.
just wondering, when you hear that question with your knowing your story, what do you have any thoughts about that?
Remind me of the name of the book.
Was Yosef on the spectrum?
Oh, okay. Can you clarify your question a little bit? I want to make sure that I answer it as fully as I can.
Sure, yeah. So the book goes through various characteristics and behavior traits to determine whether those behavior traits were really indicative of him being on the spectrum, because they are really identical to many characteristics that children who are on the spectrum have today.
Sure.
So I'm wondering, when you hear, the title of that book and just sort of a brief summary that I gave you about the book, do you have any gut reactions or thoughts about the consideration that possibly a character, not a character, but someone who has stories within the Torah itself may have had autism spectrum disorder?
Oh, I don't know. I think that's really interesting. I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. Um, I I
I mean,
really
when I
don't.
hear your experiences, and especially hear that your experiences are one of other parents, right? You guys
Right.
probably form your own group, motherhood group. um, it's irony is the first word that comes to my mind. but I wonder how much of that story is also being told, of course, or being taught,
Right.
through the schools. I would suspect it's probably
Yeah.
not taught as much as other stories, I'm sure.
I think that's interesting, because I mean, I guess depending on who you talk to within the religion and who is interpreting things in different ways, a lot is not really accepting of differences or of things like autism. But, my husband had said he found some things that maybe were supportive of people with differences or disabilities. And I wonder if more people would read something like that and see that, somebody important from our history may have actually had autism or some sort of difference, different needs, special needs, and learn and grow from that and be more open and accepting and understanding of people with disabilities rather than trying to shun them or hide them or deny that there's some sort of difficulty. I think that would be really interesting.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the book is almost a good sort of critical theory type book to go through and just really, I mean, of religion certainly is a lot about interpretation, but I thought he did a really nice job of outlining very specific instances and stories to make the argument that it's
Sure.
very possible he may have had autism spectrum disorder.
That's really interesting. I'm really interested to read that book now,
Yeah,
just to see
well,
what I think and just to see, I the more I think about it, the more first of all, I really do want to read that book, but also I think that if more people actually do believe that that's true, I really hope that more people read that and become more accepting because again, he's a very important character in our history,
right.
and that can really change things for individuals with disabilities.
I agree. It's a perfect example of just showing of disability inclusion at a minimum. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Jessica, this conversation was great. I will definitely send you information about the book and I'll put the information on my website as well.
Thank you.
Well, I thank you for being a guest and just being so open and honest about your personal story and the journey that you've gone on so far.
Thank you
That's
so much for having
continuing.
me. Yes, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. And if people have listened to the episode on thriving in the midst of chaos, they will have heard that I was very, very hesitant to share this for a long time. But for the reasons that we've discussed today and that you outlined at the beginning, it's really important. And I felt that it was really important to share my experience, even though I do kind of want to like duck and cover and not talk about it because it's private and, religion, politics, and sex, the things you don't talk about. But I think this is really important to discuss. So thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you.